Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sophie Black, and tonight we'll be taking you on a whistle-stop tour of the US media landscape, or more importantly, the US media in the frenzied midst of a US presidential campaign. Now, we could have taken inspiration from Clint Eastwood and interrogated an empty chair, but instead we've filled the three seats before you with three very engaging broadcasters and journalists, all who've had experience on the front line of US media. So Richard Fidler presents Conversations with Richard Fidler, a long-form interview program broadcast around Australia on ABC Radio. Siobhan Heanue is a journalist and presenter for ABC Television and Radio News. She joined the ABC as a news cadet and is now a Canberra-based reporter. And Julia Baird is an author, broadcaster and journalist. She's recently returned from the US, where she worked as a columnist and deputy editor of Newsweek. So please join me in welcoming. Now, Julia, I'll start with you. Some people say that you can slice the US media sort of down the middle, with each outlet either landing on the left or the right. Let's say we'll put Fox News at one end and maybe, for argument's sake, the Huffington Post down the other end. Is that a simplistic take?
Just a little bit.
Yes.
And especially when we just look at cable as well, where we just talk about Fox. We also have CNN, which preceded it by 20 odd years. Fox coming along, was it around 2002 or 2006 when they came along the same time as MSNBC. Now they have positioned themselves obviously to the right. Fox did extremely well. MSNBC on their tail came up and really decided to get very aggressively left. But we still have CNN, yes. And they're still number two. And after a decline, there was such a boom during the presidential election in terms of cable viewing, and it was very good for those on the left at MSNBC, strangely enough. People like Rachel Maddow. But after a decline, there was a big decline. Those ratings are back up. The revenue streams are really fat and really healthy. Not so much in print media as we know, but it is incredibly diverse media market. That I don't think you can slice it in half any which way you look.
Is there a danger though in the proliferation of media now, especially with online outlets as well? There's this term that's thrown around, media cocooning, that everybody can find their own cocoon of sorts that will somehow sort of reconfirm their own prejudices or worldview without taking a longer look at events or news.
Look, I think that is true, the silos, and I think that's the same on Twitter, and people tend to go to their own prejudices. To some extent, it was ever thus. People have always bought the newspaper they agreed with, in 19th century America and England and here as well. But yes, that the silo is a danger, and I think that's why it's really significant that the reputable historic brands like the New York Times, increasingly struggling financially but still doing fabulous reporting. It's really important that they continue. And let's not forget that they still have the number one position on the internet, for example, in terms of news gathering. So that hasn't been eroded, and they're still the ones that will check their facts and will have discussed things vigorously. And that's increasingly, it's a curatorial thing we're going to a lot of those mastheads for. So it's inevitable that that's going to happen online. I don't think it's always a bad thing, but I just think we want to make sure that the things that we've always gone to great brands for want of a better word, for rigour and caution and fairness and balance and accuracy, that we don't let go of that.
Now, Siobhan, I'm going to bring up the latest sort of grenade that's been thrown into the middle of the campaign, or more specifically the Mitt Romney campaign. And that's this secret video that Mother Jones have published of Romney at a fundraiser, $50,000 a head fundraiser, making a series of maybe eyebrow-raising statements, you'd call it, talking about the 47% of people who don't pay income tax, who he doesn't perhaps have to worry about, among other things, comments about the Middle East and other things. Now, a lot of conservative columnists have come out and slammed the Romney campaign for this. People like Peggy Noonan in the Wall Street Journal, William Christoph in the National Standard has absolutely slammed Romney for his stupid statements. These aren't exactly conservative commentators barracking for the Republican Party, are they?
Well, you have to remember that conservative commentators were never really barracking for Mitt Romney in the first place.
Yes.
And so we have a situation now where Mitt Romney has committed as many gaffes in just a couple of days that you would usually not be excused for doing over the course of a whole campaign. So it's no wonder really that people who are in his camp are getting pretty fed up. He's been called everything from inept to inappropriate, stupid. The campaign's been labelled with all these terrible things, and basically people on the conservative side are trying to give him a good swift kick up the pants. But I think in terms of the media and whether everything is seen through a conservative or a progressive prism, I think the most reassuring thing about the gaffes that his misspeakings over the past few days is that the media has performed its age-old role. That is, it's simply being the town crier, and if you stuff up, everyone's going to talk about it and hear about it. So there's been little in the way of twisting, really.
And that's partly because I think all the Conservatives are so upset with Romney to start with. I think were he a Reagan that had made so many gaffes, it would have been a completely different response, and it would have been the Liberal media being jumped on for twisting it and making such a big deal out of a private fundraiser, don't you think?
The best description I heard of Mitt Romney was likening him to John Kerry, which was John Kerry was a man the Democrats didn't much particularly like, but they nominated him in the hope that America would like him better. And Mitt Romney's a bit like that for the Republicans, I think. They don't really care for him much, but he's there to do a role. The odd thing about, though, these gaffes, which are really kind of moments of incredible candour, but incredibly refreshing.
Refreshing honesty, yes.
Is in Romney's case is that he's getting a lot of support suddenly from those hardline conservatives who want to have that kind of discussion. Yes, let's have that conversation. What he's saying is kind of true about 47% of, it's more like 46 apparently, % of Americans not paying income tax, but of course they pay tax in the form of payroll tax.
And they pay more tax than he would if you added it
absolutely.
up. Yes, right.
Yeah. Probably not even on a per capita head basis. I mean, probably just on a one-to-one they'd probably do. So we don't know because he won't release his tax records.
And it's interesting that Romney was, the battle for him was always going to be swinging those ultra-conservatives and taking them along for the ride, So, and we kind of began to see a bit of a shift, almost like a splicing of Mitt Romney into two campaign figures, where you had, the Mitt Romney in the big expensive commercials saying, "I'll save the economy and I'm the guy with the smarts and I know how to run businesses," but then in his stump speeches in smaller towns, you would see him start to talk about the Pledge of Allegiance and God and the flag and those things that weren't originally really so much a feature of his vocabulary. So it's interesting that he's taken it completely to the other end of the spectrum.
And the beauty of this media story is that it has that element of being behind the scenes, of being kind of forbidden, lifting the curtain. It's also an extraordinary media story because of who is behind publishing it and how the story was dug up. So, this wasn't published by one of the major networks or the New York Times or the Washington Post. This was published by Mother Jones, but not before it was gifted to Mother Jones by, of all people, the nephew of former President Jimmy Carter, who was doing a routine YouTube search, just an interested party, doing a routine Mitt Romney search on YouTube, and dug up a little clip from this particular speech and started to ask questions and got in touch with the source, who goes by the name Anonymous. So got in touch with this source and they started going back and forth with each other on Twitter. And DMing each other until he finally gained this source's confidence, started to work hand in hand with Mother Jones because he'd worked with Mother Jones before, and finally the source was convinced to hand over the whole tape. Is this sort of a sign of the way the media landscape is shifting, and is this a classic new media story?
I think it's kind of a classic example of the way rich people don't notice the hired help. I think I think, can you imagine what those waiters were thinking, hearing Mitt Romney call them deadbeats and kind of not even seeing them in the room? I mean, of course I wouldn't be surprised if it was one of them who'd shot it on an iPhone, because it's so easy to do that these days. But a guy like Mitt Romney is just not that kind of a character. He's a really weird, odd character. I think he's the most opaque presidential candidate since Nixon in a lot of ways. We don't really... It's very hard to get a sense of what really animates him and what he really thinks about many, many things. Of course, Obamacare is nothing but Romney care kind of gone national. And it's kind of interesting too that I think that the idea of Obamacare comes from, it's based on Romney Care, which came out of something out of the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. And the whole idea of cap and trade as a way of dealing with climate change, again, is using market economics out of a conservative think tank. The Republican Party seems to be running from some of its best ideas at the moment, which is a really weird thing to do for the sake of pure oppositional politics.
Especially given, much has been made of the fact that the Romney campaign have run on this idea of the Obama administration being incredibly irresponsible with debt. Debt has been this sort of main plank that they've run on. Paul Ryan, for example, the VP nominee, is very strong on this, or emphasises this a lot. But given Romney's history with Bain Capital, it's quite an extraordinary argument to make, is it not? Matt Taibbi in Rolling Stone recently wrote a story about this and basically said, this is the guy who made his fortune off debt, and yet the media is not calling him out on this. And Taibbi, who's written some pretty controversial stuff in the past, but Taibbi basically labelled the American press corps incompetent for not calling Romney out on that. What do you make of that, Julia?
Well, Taibbi does not want to pull his punches.
He's not.
He thinks everyone's pretty much incompetent. But, he's right to ask for accountability. And I thought the big one was actually to seek accountability on his tax returns. But there's so many nuances when it comes to how are you going to spin, his corporate experience. Yeah. And don't forget that's what he campaigned on for a long time. That, he knew he could roll his sleeves up. He wanted to project an air of calm competence. He'd someone who'd been in the workforce and had been successful. And I think that there's... I did a study when I was there reporting about attitudes to wealthy people in the States over the last 50, 75 years. And it's really fascinating how tenacious is the idea that you admire wealthy people, because in a second you could be them. And that really is a very kind of tangible belief. And I think that's why you can see so many wealthy people running for president. And now I know they're all trying to kind of claim that they've had the American dream and they've come from difficult backgrounds. But I think that, I think that Romney has tried to make that a strength and hasn't expected to be picked up on that.
I wonder if that flips around, though, when the wealthy guy reveals his contempt for you.
Is that why this video is cutting through so much? Is that why people are making such a big deal out of what is essentially it's another gotcha moment in some ways? Yes, but there have been throughout times in the recession, about the 1910s, again in the 1930s, and later, I think in the mid-1950s. There are times of populism that take hold. They just don't last long, and they require leadership to really go in, as Theodore Roosevelt did, and really tackle Wall Street and make strong statements. He was an incredibly gutsy president, and we've seen a bit of equivocation, to put it at best, from Obama when it comes to Wall Street. I think that really Mitt Romney was really hoping that he could spin it that way, but it's incredibly difficult when it's a time of recession and 240 million homes have been lost and foreclosed. So. That's what he's been trying to play on, I think.
And yet the 46% comment shows just how out of touch he is with that American sense of wanting to be, wealthy and wanting to climb those.
It's just exclusive as opposed to it's the exact opposite to Reagan, who assumed that all those people wanted the seniors and the veterans, and again, who do pay an incredible amount of tax. Is there an irony here where the Republicans have repeatedly said that they want to talk about the economy, that this campaign has to be about the economy, and yet we've been talking about
same-sex marriage, abortion, women's reproductive rights. And yet maybe this video is sort of refocusing that conversation again.
Well, there's one other thing that's refocusing the election. I mean, this election, before Mitt Romney had even been chosen, was supposed to be not Obama versus Romney, but Obama versus the economy. That's really what he was running against, was his record and the economic record in government. And yet the other little strange spark that we've had recently is, of course, the Middle East, which has brought foreign affairs back to the forefront in a campaign when it wasn't expected to be a focus at all. And Romney has completely stuffed it up, basically. He did that very early on with his comments about the press release from the Egyptian embassy. But there are risks there also for Obama, because he can be perceived as having been slightly weaker or leading from behind on the foreign policy front. And so that's a field where, interestingly, they're kind of pitting two interesting people against each other, and there's no clear forerunner.
Doesn't Obama just have to say the words bin Laden and dead, and he wins that?
But no one was talking about Afghanistan. No one was talking about Afghanistan. That was kind of noticeably absent from those conventions. And one thing I did notice in Iowa that I was really surprised by, and I went to a whole bunch of stump speeches, was that there were so many veterans, and especially at Ron Paul. There was a lot, and in fact, if you look at the campaign contributions, they were giving all of their money to Ron Paul, and all of their money, the greatest proportion, and for any candidate. And that was because he was the only one who had, an isolationist stance, who was saying we shouldn't be going out there and getting involved in those wars. And I think the absence of it as a substantive, matter of debate has been interesting and troubling. Completely understandable, but still.
I think that little Mitt Romney remark he made on September 11 about the what he thought was Obama's apology to the protesters in Egypt after the riots there. It's kind of says something about, going back to your very first question, about what the media landscape is like, whether it's left and right, because when you're in America, when you're consuming the media, it doesn't seem that way at all. What it seems like is a whole bunch of parallel media streams that
intersecting and shouting,
but
right.
Not often intersecting much, really. Though that's the thing. There's the Fox News Rush Limbaugh thing, and it's a mistake, I think, to see it as like, well, there's TV and there's 24-hour news. No. They kind of exist in one little sphere, a little bubble there. That kind of right-wing shout machine that's there with Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and Michael Savage and people like that. Then there's NPR, which is pleasant, polite, nice, conversational, open-minded, that kind of thing. Then there's the kind of there's this whole parallel Christian media world in the United States, which Australians aren't really aware of. Christians have their own culture, their own Christian bands, their own Christian movies they go and see, because they see the secular world as just being far too tainted for them. And then there's that kind of blogosphere, left-wing, Occupy Wall Street type thing, which kind of sadly disdains getting involved in electoral politics and thinks it's all bullshit and corrupt, and there's no point getting involved. And there are several other strata that I've probably forgotten as well, but they kind of intersect, but they don't really. They tend to shout past each other most of the time. So
there's that cocooning effect again. So given that, is there a handful of influential voices that you can reel off these days that cut through all of that the general populace tend to listen to? Or is that an old-fashioned notion now?
No. There are none. I don't think there are any. I don't know off the top of my head. I was about to say Jon Stewart, but there are a whole lot of people who don't want to hear Jon Stewart.
Well, and isn't people talk about the Daily Show and the Rachel Maddow Show and the Colbert program as examples of keeping the bastards honest, but aren't they preaching to the converted just as much as, say, Fox News?
I think if you did a breakdown of Comedy Central's audience, that would be different to the Rachel Maddow one, for example. She came on after Keith Olbermann, and she was an instant success. She was fantastic, actually. I mean, she still is. But at that time, in that election, she suddenly was plucked out and placed after Olbermann. It was so male-dominated, that part of the news. And suddenly she was almost outrating Larry King. Now, Larry King was a bit on the nose at that time. However, she did incredibly, and everyone kept writing, oh, wow, it's so surprising. What a surprising, this Oxford graduate who was a lesbian, who was incredibly smart and knew who she was and didn't play a media game. And was also funny. That was a very interesting meteor to observe, but absolutely she was playing to the left, but within her own ethical framework, which was to not have two people on to shout at each other. And that is one of the big things when we talk about who we're listening to, and is shouting. And someone reported back from the recent Democratic convention to me, one of my friends who was there said it's really hard to go on television now because people will shout over you, and if you're trying to present the reasoned middle ground, it's problematic.
What kind of responsibility do, say, producers take for that kind of conversation, given that they love this idea of conflict? They want that soundbite.
Incivility is kind of fun to watch, and
Yes.
when you look at the ratings, I mean, it is obvious that does rate well on certain networks who have their audience sitting there and they're ready and willing. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, the American viewer deserves so much more than what he or she is getting, but for an audience that purportedly doesn't like what's on offer, they really do lap up quite a lot of it. But I think when you talk about, whether we're all listening to people with our own viewpoints, a lot of it has to do with just the size of the media in the US at the moment. There is so much choice. There's such a kaleidoscope of views that, we're so far past the days when there used to be just three male anchormen sitting there in their suits, and you chose from one of three networks and you listened to the evening news, which was all carefully curated for you, and the importance of issues were decided from on high, and everyone just sucked that in as it was presented. But I think there's also a bit of a pendulum effect at play as well, and as you mentioned earlier, in the 1850s, everything that you could possibly lay your hands on to read was partisan press,
and viciously so. I think that's what we forget.
Well,
Everyone
they were
thinks
organs of the party machines, whereas now I don't think all these networks are necessarily organs of the parties, but they certainly they go with the views that provide and produce the ratings that they're after. And
The surprise that I had, though, when I was in the United States, I went to visit NPR programs like This American Life. I don't know if anyone here listens to that, the podcast of that. Radiolab and The Moth, which are these three outstanding, massively rating radio programs that have a huge audience and a lot of buzz about them. They're really important
fantastic.
shows. They're wonderful programs,
fantastic.
And meeting the people behind those programs, the thing that they all volunteered to me independently from each other is a concern about the uncivil dialogue, conversation, if that's what you can call it, in the United States, and a desire to create a program that would, and this is true of all three of those programs, which creates a forum whereby normal people can have a kind of civil conversation and have this process by which you might get some shared sympathies with someone you don't know, someone you're not familiar with, someone from a completely different background, and inhabit their mind and experience for a little while. And that's huge at the moment in the United States. There's a huge audience for this a quieter, more engaged, more curious form of radio rather than the closed-minded sort of thing. The number one radio program in the United States at the moment, everyone, if you ask people that, they go, oh, Rush Limbaugh. Oh, no. It's the Drive program on NPR. That's the number one rating program in the United States. There's a huge audience because they're balanced. They don't play into that. It can't be used as a weapon the way Rush Limbaugh can use his show as a weapon and use it to galvanise support to support something or to defeat something.
I wanted to talk a little bit too about something that's been discussed within the media over the last month or so around the presidential election, and it's this idea of fact-checking. Fact-checking has sort of come into its own in some weird way.
What a crazy idea that journalists should do fact-checking.
Yes. I mean, I think it was back in January, it was the public editor of the New York Times. He posed a question to his readers which seemed incredibly controversial. He asked if the paper should become a truth vigilante. Basically, he was saying that, look, we've got a fact-checking function in the sidebar of our stories. We've got our op-ed columnists who freely give their opinion and call people out on bullshit, but our reporters don't build that into their mechanism when they are reporting. So it comes back to this idea of he said, she said journalism, of journalists not wanting to let go of that notion of neutrality, and as a result people don't get called out on these sorts of things. Now, online, we're seeing a whole lot of different fact-checking outlets coming into their own as well. So PolitiFact is a Pulitzer Prize-winning site that rates politician statements from everything from true to false to Liar, Liar, Pants on Fire, I think is the worst rating you can get. Their website melted down during the Republican National Convention, and especially during VP nominee Paul Ryan's speech. Siobhan, when did fact-checking and journalism become separate functions?
Well, I think there was a very telling headline. I think it might have been in the Washington Post, and James Fallows of The Atlantic pointed this out, and I believe he's speaking here later on. He's fantastic. But he highlighted this headline which said, errors compromising Romney campaign, comma, some in GOP say. And you really could have just slashed that last phrase off the headline and it would have still been accurate and made sense. And that is representative of this obsession with, a little bit to this side of the argument, a little bit to that side, and, judicious journalists like to be seen to be giving every side of the argument equal weighting. But the question is then asked, well, but what's actually right? What is truthful? And the fact-checking phenomenon fact-checker, which is funded by the Annenberg Foundation, a non-profit organisation, that began in 2008 during that campaign, but it's really gathering steam now. And as you say, during the VP speech, it went into meltdown. And I think one of the best examples was of fact-checking actually came when Ryan gave his marathon time. He said that he ran a sub 3-hour marathon, which only extremely elite people can do.
The body fat's the other one.
It's almost impossible to, for a man of his...
And the factory that Obama closed down before he was elected president, that thing, yeah.
Right.
Lies after lie after lie. I mean, these are lies, aren't they? I mean,
the problem here
I don't think Ryan even knew that he was giving a completely off the realm of possibility. He obviously believed what he was saying, and it actually took your netizens on running forums to kind of analyse it and go, hang on, no, I don't think that would be possible.
Do you think he really did know what he was saying, though?
Media.
Do you really think he knew what he... I mean, he didn't know. I mean, this is in his own electorate he's talking about a factory closing down. I mean...
Surely you're going to anticipate that you're going to get picked up on a comment like that, though. Is it different to... a lot of Romney statements that have been repeated over and over again? For example, President Obama apologising to the world shortly after he got elected for America's actions. Romney has repeated this over and over again. It's been rated pants on fire, 5 Pinocchio noses, whatever rating you want to give it. He continues to repeat this assertion. Now, the campaign has shown just a disregard for being called out. They don't seem to care. And in fact, a Romney aide has said that fact-checking has jumped the shark. What do journalists do if politicians simply refuse to acknowledge or to let this kind of thing stop them?
Right. I mean, I think in a way what we're talking about is what journalists have always done, to be honest with you. And now we're kind of saying we're fact-checking. This isn't an argument and saying you're a liar.
Yeah.
This isn't. I mean, Colbert for a long time has been talking about truthiness.
Yes,
yes.
Or people misspeak. They don't lie. They misspeak.
And then there's asking questions in a certain way and implying something else. Is Obama really a Muslim? I don't know. Who's actually seen his birth certificate? All that kind of stuff. And there was a lot of truthiness happening there and untruthiness, and spin. And I do think that there always can be more rigour in most organisations, but a lot of fact-checking happens and it's written off as the media being the media, So we kind of get caught up into the political spin that way. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times a couple of months ago, and I had a full day backwards and forwards with their fact-checkers on things like, you say you interviewed a historian. No, you say there's a quote from a historian. Well, where's that from? I'm like, an interview with me, 2nd of August, 2012. They're like, well, where are your notes? And then I said there were about 1,000, letters in the National Library. Does that include correspondence to and from, or is it just postcards? I mean, it was an unbelievable and unrelenting level of fact-checking.
Is that unique, though? I mean, a lot of people talk about the lack of resources now, the cost-cutting.
Yes, no, that's true.
Fact-checking is one of the first things to go.
That's true. But I do think it's a core part of journalism, and I think the moment we start to say, oh, now there's separate groups for that, which are great, and we need them, and it's an important part of the discourse when there are so many lies which are being given to us over and over again blatantly, it's very important. But the moment we start to hive that off, then journalism just has become bloviating, and hot air and opinion and argument, and the liberal media versus the right-wing media. And that is just does a complete disservice to all these people out there who are trying to get things right.
But the other pressure for journalists, particularly in 24-hour news television, is the fact that audience viewers want turnarounds of the story straight away. And I think whereas magazines and print publications often do hang on to, they retain their fact checkers, which is marvellous to see. In TV world, it's much easier sometimes, or it's the only option really for someone who's standing on the floor at the National Convention to kind of, turn it around in 30 seconds flat. You're ready with the earpiece in and you're going live as soon as Obama or Romney shuts his trap.
Then who are you there for? Then who are you there for then? I mean, why are you doing that? If you're just a publicist then, aren't you? I mean, really, if there's no time to do it, all you can do is just say, well, this is what someone has said, then you're someone...
Well, that's where the pundits have come into the pundit class, that's what we fill up so much of the airtime with, is these people, these talking heads who go back and forth with instant analysis and commentary, which can be interesting, but you're not getting your facts and your in-depth analysis in that forum.
CNN's Wolf Blitzer came under fire for doing exactly that after Paul Ryan's speech. He said, great reaction from the crowd, commented on the colour, then said there's a few facts there that might need checking. Didn't say what they were. We'll get back to you. It's coming up on the internet, on Twitter and these.
That's right.
What should he have done in that circumstance, Richard?
I think there's this kind of race to be first all the time that trips poor old CNN up all the time, namely when the Supreme Court decision came down on Obamacare and they reported it had gone the other way. That race to be first, be there to bring it to you as it happens right now.
Or if you're wrong, you're not wrong for long.
That's right, yeah. There's that thing. I mean... Right. I think there needs to be a reassessment about the way these things are reported on. I think there's an inherent problem with any 24-hour news channel, the way it runs things. I think ultimately they're pretty worthless. Worthless, really, in fact. As media and reporting institutions, there's no time for reflection. You really become publicists for someone else's stage-managed production, and that was true. The Democrats
thing,
thing,
to keep people notified. That's the correct word. Is they're there to keep people notified and on top of the news as it happens. But I think that's where this idea of media literacy, and I think there is a responsibility on viewers and punters to be a bit more judicious in what media they choose to, and you can't, you can lead a horse to water, but I think that's where the vast choices that are available are so valuable, because people can dip in and out of all those different forums for what they seek and what they require.
I think a lot of the times in that context, reporters are very mindful of the obligation they have to the people that they're reporting on. In the convention, the politicians they're reporting on. NPR in the National Public Radio in the United States has just changed its editorial policy from a set of rules to a series of guidelines, and they've declared that they have a bias towards the truth. And this is, which is a really lovely and refreshing thing to read, because the previous document was all about their credibility and presenting both sides of an argument. And, we in the ABC have this terrible thing as well. We have someone from the left, someone from the right, and the truth comes out the middle. That's the assumption. Sometimes someone's absolutely wrong and truth is heavily balanced on one side or the other. And the idea is, well, we gave you both a hearing. We fulfilled our obligation to you, Senator Brandis, and you to Wayne Swan. Therefore, we're not mindful of our obligations to our listeners or our viewers when we do that, when we make that mistake, when really first and foremost we should be doing that, have a bias towards our listeners and viewers and bias towards the truth of the matter in these things.
It's true, but one of the things that we've all had to do increasingly, speed did not, especially with print, that wasn't part of our arsenal before. We didn't have to really be fast. I mean, the generation before us had their long lunches. They often came back drunk. They could file at like 11 o'clock at night. We hear all these great stories about the grand old days. And now we have to file for the net, like as soon as you arrive at work. So it's a challenge for everyone, not just people on television. In a way, you kind of need to have that built in. The kind of the constant fact checking and consciousness, because speed too is a problem in the political cycle. And we were talking about the leaking of the video before. Another terrible example was when, over on the extreme right, the Andrew Breitbart's group released that video of Shirley Sherrod. Remember, she was part of the Obama administration and she had overseen land grants and something. She gave a long speech where she said that as a black woman, she had struggled at times when white people came to her asking for help. She'd grown up, a whole family, very in the deep South, a history of great, discrimination and racism. This grab was on. She was sacked in 24 hours, and by the Obama administration before they'd seen the full speech, which was kind of a story about grace and how she learnt that that she had to look white people in the face and recognise that not everyone was racist and recognise that they too needed help. And it was kind of quite a profound tale, but that was completely missed for an entire 24 hours. And by the time she was like, I don't want my job back.
So is it all the internet's fault?
No, but of course the internet has changed, absolutely.
Has it created this appetite, though? I mean, can't journalists resist that in some ways? Can't we see...
But the appetite is great. It's a wonderful thing because everyone's talking, but we see the decline of print, but the appetite for news is enormous. And unrelenting. We don't know how to make money from it, which is very unfortunate.
That's the minor detail.
So we can employ some fact checkers and great journalists. But no, I think the appetite is robust and fantastic. The consumer is better catered for than they ever have been. Kind of videos and streaming, in terms of the apparatus and the modes of delivery.
I was I interviewed John Nichols, who's a writer, chief political writer for The Nation magazine, and he was here during the 2010 election campaign, which I think, I don't know, would we have much trouble agreeing that was one of the most appalling election campaigns? And, George Megalogenis says if he has to go through that, he'd kill himself again, an election campaign like that. He was watching it unfold, and he said one of the first things journalists should do in Australia, from his experience, is get off the bus, get off the campaign bus, and stop showing up at these ridiculous daily events, which are a strange bit of weird political kabuki where the Prime Minister will kiss a koala or something and the pictures are taken. Often, and journalists, you can maybe, you often get like the policy statement that accompanies it. You've got 30 seconds with it? 2 minutes.
30 seconds, yeah.
You should, during the last Queensland election, something really interesting happened. The Courier Mail made the announcement it was getting off the bus. It was going to report the election from outside the staged managed events of the campaign. I hope that takes on. I hope to see more of that.
Well, how much do both American politicians and our politicians back here, how much do they bear responsibility for this sort of dearth of information, given that they... some of their rhetoric is beyond fact-checking. It's so meaningless that journalists have nothing to work with. I mean, a Tony Abbott doorstop could involve him filleting a fish or donning a pair of safety goggles and a fluoro vest.
No, it will feature those things.
Yes,
it will.
Yes.
And those things will feature on the news, which I think is problematic as well. No one in the American public, well, hardly anyone knew that FDR was in a wheelchair because the journalists didn't report it because they didn't think it was important. Hardly anyone knew about JFK's affairs while he was having them, while he was president, because once again there was this kind of gentleman's agreement, and I'm not saying whether that was a good or a bad call, but the press agreed tacitly what was worth reporting and what was not worth reporting. Whereas now everyone is on the bus, because if you are not on the bus, you might miss the shot where the Prime Minister falls over and loses her shoe, or you might miss the Tony Abbott gaffe, So there's this kind of, I think, more intense competition and a lack of kind of cooperation, where perhaps in generations gone by, the press were competitive but agreed that they had kind of common goals and common truths to expose, and that doesn't necessarily exist so much anymore.
Or maybe it's up to the press to do as the Courier Mail did and say, we're not getting on the bus, we're not doing this anymore, this is ridiculous. It goes back to that sort of post-truth environment where so much of this is spectacle and commenting on the spectacle and the colour. Richard, you had a great quote that you read in the back room before. I don't know if you want to read it.
I just thought I'd bring it in. It's worth writing out longhand because it's kind of amazing. It's from a book written by an American writer and journalist called Ron Suskind, who was writing about the Bush administration. And it's kind of a famous quote now, and it's used to, it's coined all sorts of phrases. It was the most important phrase in this book he'd written about the Bush administration. I think this was written around 2006. So we're into, the second Bush term with that. And he was talking to an unnamed White House senior aide, which most people seem to think is Karl Rove. And I'm just quoting from the book here. He said, the aide said that guys like me, that's him, Susskind, we're in what we call the reality-based community. By that he meant people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. Susskind said, I nodded and murmured something about Enlightenment principles and empiricism. He cut me off. That's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality judiciously as you will, I love all the contempt in that, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to study what we do.
He was a humble man.
He was.
Yeah. This little dweeb from Texas is in the White House with a pliable president and figures he can move the furniture of reality on the whole wide world. I mean,
and that explains so much.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. But you can lead yourself into terrible situations where you think, I suppose for a while you can live like that when you're as powerful as that. But eventually it comes back and bites you on the arse, doesn't it? I hope it does.
Or the whole world.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Well, given that, I mean, if we think back to the last presidential election and what has happened since then, it's quite extraordinary. The issues that have been put on the table, the stimulus package, healthcare, we've seen the rise and sort of fall of the Occupy movement. It's quite extraordinary, and the Arab Spring, you know, just to name a handful of issues, and yet a lot of this campaign so far has been dominated by arguments around, you know, same-sex marriage, and we've talked a lot about Mitt Romney, but the Obama campaign are very, very slick. You visited their campaign headquarters when you were on your fellowship last year, didn't you, Siobhan? And they just Obama very brilliantly just threw in that support for same-sex marriage and just watched as the accolades came pouring in. How complicit are the media for picking up with that and running with those sorts of issues instead of saying, hang on, is abortion really the big issue here? Should we be talking more about...
Well, it is, because in so many states they're trying to, you know, wind it back. It's a big republic. It is, you know, they keep calling it the war on women. It really is. How many states are there in the US now? It's at least half.
It comes some kind of vaginal ultrasound in a lot of states now, doesn't it? Seriously,
yes.
Yeah.
So that is real. I mean, we were talking before about the economy, and when I had to do a study of Sarah Palin in the last election, because women got really excited when Sarah Palin got in. They really did initially. There was a big bounce when she bounced into the convention herself and was all hockey mum, and she was so refreshing and appealing, and she seemed at that point real. There was a big bounce in the polls, and so I went and looked at the way women voted again over the last century, and it was every single election, it is always about the economy. And all these other factors kind of come in and out, and there's a lot of dog whistling for, you know, the moral issues and so on. Though I think that, you know, I think there are a lot would-be women who'd be put off by actually what's been going on, because it's been very blatant.
Yes, and it is, abortion is a very important issue, but it doesn't rate in the sort of top 10, I don't think, top 10 voter concerns when they actually enter the poll booth.
Right.
So why aren't we talking about the fact that the country was teetering on the edge of depression?
Obama's record's really ordinary. The economy, where's unemployment now? 8% in the United States? I mean, he's done some way to fixing the mess he inherited, but it's pretty ordinary. And even though he had complete control of the Congress for some period of time, the legislation that was pushed through was, again, pretty ordinary. He's very, very vulnerable, I would have thought. But the Republican Party seems to be going through something like a nervous breakdown at the moment, where it's living in its own media sphere, and this is where the Egyptian thing came from again, I think I was going to bring this up, but where Romney saw that tweet come out of the Egyptian embassy. It was picked up by the right-wing blogosphere saying, Obama's people are apologising to the world again. And within that echo chamber that Romney's campaign people are in, they go, aha, this is it, this is a moment. They're going to love us if we ping Obama on this. But then that media world doesn't intersect too well with a larger media world, and so it didn't. It just went like that and fell flat. And they go, well, what happened? You're biased against us. And so Romney should be easily winning this. But the fact that he isn't is because he's right within this kind of strange Führerbunker that is the Republican Party, constantly getting news from the front saying that the Russians, they're falling beneath our tanks at the moment. You know, this is what's happening, and I don't think he's making very good decisions as a result of that. The strange, distorted media sphere that his campaign is living within.
Well, on that note, I think we'll throw to the audience so that they can do some fact-checking of their own. So if anyone has a question, raise your hand and we'll get to you. This gentleman in the front row for starters.
Hello. I'm an American, and I think the political criticism in the States is in good shape. I mean, you catch stuff like the Romney, like the Mother Jones Romney stuff. One of the reasons I think The Daily Show is so popular is because they do media criticism. Mm-hmm. They criticize each other, and Media Watch here is a place that does it really well. But you don't see it anywhere among like mainstream media organizations. And in the States and here, do you feel any role that you should be doing that? Like, it's good to hear you talk about them covering Julia Gillard kissing a koala, but you don't read about it in the paper or see it on the news anywhere, making fun of people for going and attending these dumb events.
Well, one of the most interesting things that happened during the last campaign was a well-known blogger called Grog's Gamut, who people might have heard of. Greg Jericho is his real name. He was a Canberra public servant, and he did exactly that. He basically ripped into the media about how they were covering the campaign and how superficial it was. And his post went viral. He became popular and got a book deal, and the media were basically taken to task, and there was this great big period of, navel gazing and introspection.
Mark Scott saw it and brought it up in an ABC board meeting. And
it went right to the top. Yeah. And I think the Daily Show is also indicative of that, that desperate need to really criticise the Fourth Estate, And the most interesting thing, I talked to a bunch of journalism students at USC in Los Angeles, and I asked them how many watched this show, that show. None of them watch TV at all. They all got their news from Twitter or from Facebook, posts. They would read the posts that their friends had posted, which in itself poses problems. But I think people are reacting, particularly in that younger generation, and they're basically turning away from mainstream media.
I think it would be great if we did have a Jon Stewart here and we had that form. I mean, there are very deep struggles and fights within the media. They're expressed in a different way. They're not funny, and they're not on prime time. You would, if you looked at the Australian today, you would see it on the front page. The Quarterly Essay and the Australian. They fought over Rudd. They fought over Robert Mann's recent essay about them, and now they're fighting about the coverage of Tony Abbott, which has pulled in the ABC. Does the ABC have a Catholic bias? Does the Quarterly Essay? Does David Marr?
Not to mention our totalitarian sympathies.
They both jumped in so quickly. So, not in a totalitarian way.
Cardigan tonight.
I've always been a massive Kim Jong-il fan. And,
yes, right. I can see it, actually, from the way you read that quote so admiringly. Yes. So, no, they absolutely exist. I mean, it got so bad for a while during the 1990s, so many columnists, to be honest, with massive egos brawling with each other, that it got very boring, and the Herald tried to shut it down and not actually publish so many of them. So, but what you're talking about is a very sophisticated form of political humour that I would love to see more. If we see it in The Chaser, they do some of those things, and The Hamster Wheel was a lot about media criticism, so, yes.
Okay, who else has a question? Yes, down the front here.
Thanks very much to the Wheeler Centre again for another great session. You agree with you that Romney and Ryan are bozos. You finally got to some critical comment about Barack's presidency at the end. Can I ask you other three if you could possibly come up with something critical about Obama?
Things, yes.
And can I also say to Sophie, the idea that Barack Obama is a hero for killing Osama bin Laden is laughable. Thank you.
But it has been interesting to see how he trades off
has used
that.
Well, criticising.
Well, okay. Well, it's more about the campaign and how the campaign is exploiting that. That was what my statement intended.
And also what the American people wanted and how they responded to that, and that is seen, is seen as a coup. If we're talking about in those simply political terms, you might have a different take on it. There is an incredibly robust debate within the US, as you would know, about Obama's merits and failings. One of the great problems was always going to be that he was this messianic creature promising hope. He was always a pragmatist. We knew he was a pragmatist, but his rhetoric and the hope and the need, everything he represented far exceeded always what he was going to be able to deliver. Then there was a recession, healthcare. I don't think really satisfied many people at all. It fell far short of really what people on both sides or a whole bunch in the middle had hoped that it would do, but it was historic and it was huge, because that had not been achieved for a very long time. An overhaul of health. His deal with the pharmaceutical, his dealings with Wall Street. The bailout was inherited, but the way the bailout was executed in the first couple of months are very problematic. Yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say he appointed a couple of real hacks to fix the economic situation the United States found itself in Larry Summers and in Timothy Geithner as well. But two men who were actually kind of instrumental in creating the mess in the first place. And he had much better advice from Ronald Reagan's former head of the Fed, which was Paul Volcker, who was giving him much better advice. One would have thought, and probably would have produced a much better result for the US and world economy as a result. So, yeah.
See how easy that is? You can come up with some comments if you think about it.
We're not here to sort of say Barack Obama's every bit as bad as the Republicans. We're here to talk about how crap the media is.
And also, don't forget this week, if his talk about guns, clinging to guns and religion was this week, we would have been talking about Obama. Yeah. Romney's in the news.
So is it that the media are focusing too much on the Romney gaffes rather than looking at the Obama record? Is that part of it?
Well, are they gaffes?
No, that's right.
He's at a meeting of donors and he's speaking from the heart, for whatever that is, for the first time in his life, it would seem, and makes these remarks which he thinks clearly are true. So that's not a gaffe. That's not a kind of stupid gotcha moment. We've seen plenty of those stupid gotcha moments which mean nothing ultimately. That's not really. That's him saying, and that a lot of people in his own party believe. They just wouldn't really want to make the case for him.
I think that you can say that the media are not charmed by him as they often want to be, and they're not. Clinton was charming. McCain was charming. A lot of people kind of warmed to him, and I think that's been one of the crucial things, that people struggle to understand him. And so I don't think he's a bozo. I think that throughout this campaign it's been difficult, and when I went to see him, I saw in a couple of his speeches, I was right next to him at a tiny little diner in Iowa. It's hard to get a sense of who he is. It's hard to get that. He doesn't have that gift. He's got many other gifts, and he's certainly made it this far. And I thought Anne Romney was very charismatic up close, and that's one of the things that we grapple with. One of the most I won't go on too long, but it's one of the most interesting things I heard was from one of his former strategists. He was talking to me in Iowa, and I was like, why can't we get a sense of who he is? And he said his theory was that a lot of it's his faith. That in Mormonism, you get married behind closed doors. If you have a funeral, no one who's not a Mormon can't come. He thinks that he's very much contained because he's been spiritually trained. That's just something that's completely thrown out there, but just made me think a lot. That's something we're grappling with. It's not about being a bozo.
Can we also contrast him with John McCain? John McCain, who is, well, by my lights anyway, a hero. A man who chose to continue in a Vietnamese torture cell rather than leave his friends behind. A man who was noted for his intelligence, his candour, his attempt to introduce campaign finance reform. You could see him in 2008 frustrated by the dumbass process that is American presidential politics, jumping on gaffes, not being able to talk more candidly and openly, which is what he was really good at.
I think you're making a really important distinction as well, because I do think the media sometimes with gaffes, we need them to be more candid. We know that they all lie to us all the time, and sometimes we force them to do it. Do you disagree with your leader on this? We want them to say, yeah, of course I do. I do. I've always been for gay marriage until I took on this role, and now suddenly, like that ridiculous interview, who was it who said, I haven't heard was it Shorten? Bill Shorten? He said, I haven't heard what Julia Gillard said at the end, but I agree with her. It's a ridiculous thing, but in a way we ask it. If someone differs from the leader, they get absolutely hammered, and we should allow for, I think, more robust debate in that sense.
But I think people do want to see a lot more of Romney, as you've touched on. And the thing about Obama and McCain and even Palin was they all had really interesting backstories. They all had fascinating life stories to tell and to write about and publish about. Right. And, political strategists say that, presidential campaigns or politics is like selling beer. There has to be kind of a convincing narrative narrative there somewhere. There has to be a good story. And I think with Romney, you know, there was so much fear about whether his religion, his faith would have a negative impact on his campaign that I think they really did close doors around him,
Yes.
and we really haven't been able to see the
But
man.
if he spoke more about it, we would have a sense more of who he was.
Of who he is
but
and what
that's
drives
why
him.
the convention, it was all about humanising him, I think.
We'll throw to the back for a question.
I'd like to ask the panel for their opinion on the New York Times, and the reason why I'm asking is that in the last month I read the New York Times because I was in Canada, and one thing that impressed me about it was the material they wrote on Paul Ryan. They started off giving his life history, in a sense, what his university experience was, how he was brought to a very conservative position by his professor, and then afterwards he was influenced by Ayn Rand, and so on. It went in great detail. It gave all the details about his financial position and so on, and he was seen as being a bright and perhaps very useful member of the Republican Party. However, they then went on to detail his attitude about abortion, about Medicare, and what would happen to Medicare if his program was put into practice. I was very impressed by the New York Times, and I just wondered what the panel thought of this particular publication.
Who wants to
I
start
think we'll
there?
probably agree, but you guys...
Well, we probably will. Look, the one thing that impressed me about the New York Times, and I sat in on a morning editorial meeting, which is this fantastic spectacle of mostly women and a few men as well on that day, sitting around the table debating what would be in the news and what wouldn't that day or the next day. And what impressed me the most was that there was not one reference to what any other outlet was doing, you know. But around this country and around the US, that's a big deal, you know. What have they got today? Well, we're going to follow that story that they broke. We're going to take it another direction. New York Times, there was just no mention of what anyone else was doing. It was, right, we're going to set our agenda. And I believe that that's what they do every day, and that's what makes them so valuable. They're a magnificent institution.
Yeah, I agree. I miss even the paper version, getting the paper version every day quite intensely. I think they're extremely serious about what they do, and they devote resources to intense investigative work. They're incredibly careful with facts. They appointed a public editor, so now they will beat themselves, you know, around the head if they think they've erred in any stories, and they've had some very strong-minded public editors who have not pulled any punches. I admire it enormously, and any of the individuals I know from there honestly are kind of, again, very serious, quite brilliant, and you know, they're all really... And there's a lot of talk about bias in the New York Times, but they're all really committed to America and to a debate about democracy and what's fair and what would be the best outcome for the most people.
And to America's place in the world, which I don't
America's
think is
place in the
reflected in a lot of other publications so much as it is in the Times.
That's definitely true, yeah.
I remember when that article that editorial you referred to came out, where it said, should the New York Times be a truth vigilante, which is almost an unfortunate moment, because, you know, there was the sound of a million foreheads slapping heads going, well what do you reckon?
Yeah.
I mean... and also to the New York Times, I don't know, shame/credit, it had an unfortunate episode in the lead up to the Iraq War where it published a lot of spurious stuff by journalist Judith Miller. And after it was shown to be her information was spurious, they did produce a big mea culpa, and they then began a kind of discussion within their own pages. You know, we screwed up here. How did we get this important thing wrong? How do we make sure this never happens again? It's hard to see the Australian doing that, or the Fairfax papers as well to some degree. I mean, it's just hard to see that kind of,
right.
We got it wrong. How can we do better next time?
But I think that your talk about the Iraq War is really interesting, because there's been a lot of people that were for it, that were against it 3 or 4 or 5 years later, and have never said that I changed my mind and this is why, or this is what I got wrong. And the New York Times did it institutionally, and a lot of talk especially about Colin Powell's evidence and how pivotal that was. In changing their thinking. But I have, you know, I've really regretted that a lot of thought leaders haven't been accountable for what they said and what they argued at the time. And I think more individual journalists should actually do that when they're columnists.
Yeah, I think we're bad at that in Australia too, aren't we?
The caravan moves
we
on
really
so
are.
quickly.
Yeah.
doesn't it?
The interesting thing about the New York Times is that they're also leading the way in terms of finding a new business model. The world of media is watching them very carefully because they seem to be suggesting there is a way forward for getting people to pay for online content.
There is, and the New York Times has an edge in the sense that they have so much gravitas in that masthead. And the challenge for papers in migrating to online is that they need to leverage the credibility of their mastheads into new platforms that are quite foreign, perhaps to their journalists and certainly to their editors. And the New York Times has had that huge amount of power to be able to do that in one fell swoop. And like The Guardian, they actually expand their readership when they concentrate on their online delivery, because suddenly they become this international paper of record. So that's where their power and their thrust lies, and that's why everyone else around the world is following their lead. But they also do have so much more money. I mean, when you look at papers like the LA Times, for instance, which was once, it's 125 years old, so powerful, it's halved its number of journalists in the past 5 years, and it's basically cut all its foreign bureau staff. But the New York Times still has all those people around the world reporting, and they invest an incredible amount of money in security alone, and logistics, which other papers can't or won't do.
Okay, one more question and then we're done. We've got one in the middle there, to be fair.
I was interested in what you had to say about politeness and people shouting over each other on American television. And I'm wondering if there's a show like Q&A in America. I mean, I know Q&A has its faults, but it does give ordinary people a chance to ask politicians and other experts questions that they're interested in hearing the answers for. It generally stays fairly civil, not always, but generally. And I'm just wondering if there's a show like it in America, or if there isn't, would it at all be possible?
Let's do it. Let's take one there. Yeah, it's been remarkably successful here. No, I keep thinking of the Charlie Rose's, and there's the traditional Sunday morning forum is usually where you'll see politicians being spoken to seriously, but not so much with a range of other people from the community, which I think is so good. The
Q&A model is an interesting one because essentially it means to get interesting questions asked of politicians, you have to outsource it from journalists and give it to the general public. One of the earliest episodes of Q&A that I enjoyed the most was when a panellist, a federal frontbencher, was asked a question who gave his party's talking points. And Tony Jones had the wit to say to that person at the back, "Are you happy with that answer?" He said, "I've never heard so much bullshit in all my life." and everyone laughed like that. And then the politician concerned laughed. And he went, "Look," and then started talking the way politicians do when the media aren't around and they practice electoral surgery and they talk like normal human beings. And I'm guessing probably if you've ever had a personal encounter with a local member, it's probably been they come across much better in person than they do on TV. It's because we in the media box them in all the time. We're always, and as soon, even these days in Q&A, you see a situation where Malcolm Turnbull will say something interesting, and you see Tony swivel around and goes, "But your leader says this. But then won't your leader be unhappy with this?" And you get this sense of them being boxed in and pushed back into their talking points again. This is something. It's kind of discipline I try to set myself as an interviewer, is to, if I hear someone say something interesting, you don't go, "Aha!" Let them go, because you're there for the listeners, you're there for the audience, you're there to enlighten them, and that's if you give that person the opportunity to speak more candidly, then that's all for the better of the people listening or watching.
And that's why your show is so wonderful.
Well, thank you.
It's so wonderful because you people properly tell their stories, and you don't box and you don't point score. And it's just, anyway, it's delightful.
Well, speaking of boxing people, I'm afraid we are going to have to draw this to a close. I suspect we could bang on about this for hours over a bottle of red. But will you please join me in thanking Richard Fidler, Siobhan Heanue and Julia Baird.